Well, good evening and welcome to the Community Development Committee meeting for September 21, 2023. Welcome, and we're going to start out with a roll call. That would be you.
Dan Hansen.
Here.
Jerry Van Someren.
Here.
Ryan Shirley.
Present.
Scott Counter.
Present.
Sean Anderson's going to be late. I talked to him. So the minutes, does anybody have any additions, corrections, suggestions with the minutes from our last meeting in August? No? Then without any objection, we'll let them stand as approved. And regarding public comment, if you're here to talk about one of the 3 rezonings, that's different than public comment. And I would ask you to sign in the sheet that's provided for that. And if you'd like to speak for public comment, which is anything that's on or off the agenda, fill out one of these little guys, turn it in here, and we'll ask you to come up and speak. Now, I have one from Tim Wiltzman, and I'd invite you to come up to the podium and say your piece.
It's going to be on the accessory dwelling unit. Is that going to be on the agenda?
It is, Tim, but yeah, this is one we're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. My name is Tim Witzman with the Town of Somerset, and I came tonight basically concerning the accessory dwelling unit standards. My first concern was that we were, as a town, were not notified that this was even being proposed. We found out through some other channels, but I think it would have been in the best interest of the county to notify the townships located in the county of this proposed ordinance change or standard change. So that was my first comment. A couple of the other things that I went through on item G, it says the ADU shall not be sold separately from the principal residential structures unless all the requirements of the St. Croix County's ordinances are met. Within the town of Somerset, we have a 3-acre minimum. The county has a different minimum for their lot standards. So if somebody had, I think it's an 1.5 acres or 2 acres in the county. So if somebody had 3 acres, and if it's an 1.5 acres in the county, they could actually subdivide that lot following the St. Croix County ordinances. So it doesn't mention any of the towns because towns will have ordinances that differ from that. So that was a concern of mine. Item H, which says a lot containing an ADU shall be occupied by the owner of the premises. The owner may live in either the ADU or the principal residential structure. And item I, which it talks about short-term rental, tourist rooming house for less than 7 days per reservation, not more than 180 consecutive days per year. Both of those would become enforcement issues. My concern is now we do have some enforcement issues that we were working with the county on, but it's a very long process. And I think with these restrictions, or I should say these guidelines or items listed under the standards, it would greatly increase the amount of enforcement required to support and make sure that the ordinances are being followed. So I really have a question with that. I don't know if there's a proposal to staff up as a result of that. Typically when you have short-term rentals, I've seen other counties where they actually have charged a fee and required people to support that. The ADU shall have a separate entrance and address from that of the principal residence structure. And I'm just kind of wondering with regards to the fire department, all of a sudden you have 2 fire numbers at the end of a driveway, or if you have 2 driveways, and that piece becomes a little confusing for them. And I guess that was it. I guess my 2 points is that I think it's going to take a lot more enforcement to change rules and be able to make sure that people are living by the guidelines set up by the county. And at this point, I question whether or not there's staffing even to support the current ordinances and guidelines that we have within the county. So adding more to that would only require more staffing. Now, there's a possibility of charging people who do that a fee, an annual fee that would support a position to do that. But you know, within the town, we have some concerns about really the enforcement. And again, going back to the fact that when something like this comes up, I think it would be beneficial to notify the towns directly that this is being considered. Thank you.
Real good, thank you, Tim. And I have Ed Schochner, who I'd like to mention, had served on this committee for 8 years. Welcome back.
I'm Ed Schochner, the chairman of the town of Somerset, and I reiterate everything that Tim had just said, but we all know that these are going to turn into rental units. I mean, you can say they're going to be for grandma or whoever, but eventually they'll be rental units. So we're basically putting duplexes on single lots. And some of my concern with that is, in our type of ground in Somerset, it's pretty sandy, and you end up with, and that's why we like to stay with the 3-acre lots, is because you end up with sewer and water too close to each other. And if the county's looking for affordable housing in the towns, I think we need to come up with some different kind of a solution. I think we need to, you know, group housing with one main sewer system. There's something that needs to be done if we're going to do that. You know, things will have to be changed, but I don't think we want to push this through the way this is presented. I think there's got to be a better solution than trying to put accessory units that'll turn into rental units. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Appreciate you coming. Do we have anybody else who'd like to speak during public comment on any subjects on or off the agenda? I'll ask one last time, would anybody else like to speak during public comment? All right, we'll move on. I'm going to open the first public hearing. This is going to be concerning the Jensen request in the town of Hammond. We'll ask for a staff report. John, thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and committee members. Our first public hearing tonight is for a rezoning application by Pamela Jensen. The property in question is at 1869 Highway 12 in Hammond, the town of Hammond. Specifically, the rezoning request is to rezone 10.2 acres from C1 commercial to R2 residential for purposes of a smaller residential development. Next, we'll just take a look at the general location of the 10 acres. As you can see, it abuts the village limits of Hammond, located north of Interstate 94. Next, we take a little bit closer look with the aerial photo. On the 10 acres, there is currently a 6,000 square foot Quonset hut. There really appears to be no active commercial use, although the building may be used for storage. Next is a draft certified survey map that was proposed by the owner. You can see the 4 lots being proposed, each exceeding the minimum lot size requirement of 2 acres. And again, the certified survey map process is a separate process being reviewed by our land division staff. And again, just a larger perspective, the blue box indicates the 10 acres with the location relative to the village of Hammond. And then a view from Highway 12 looking south, showing the property. You see the Quonset hut in the foreground, then off to the left, it's primarily used for agriculture. Next, we take a look at the general features of the property. The property highlighted in blue is the subject property. The areas you see in yellow are currently zoned R2 residential, which allows most ag uses and residential development with 2 acre lot minimums. You'll also see the village limits here with the smaller lots. The smaller lots in the village that you see under the red arrow are currently zoned residential within the village limits. Rezonings are required by state law to be consistent with the town's comprehensive plan. So we just took a quick snippet of the future land use map from the town of Hammond. You kind of see the blue line here at the point of the arrow. That represents the 10 acres. You see a smaller red sliver kind of off to the northwest corner of the property that's guided for commercial. The vast majority of the site is designated in the mixed rural development category. Next, we take a look at the county future land use plan that pretty much mirrors the town plan. We have some mixed rural agricultural future land use designations, and then a small sliver of commercial, which pretty much overlays the Quonset hut area of the property. Next, we take a look at natural resource features that may or may impact the development of the property. And as you can see here, there are no sensitive areas or scenic and rec areas. We do have a waterfowl protection area that's located to the east, approximately 100 feet of the subject property. And that is a larger wetland complex on property owned by U.S. Fish and Wildlife. As you can see, there are no shoreland, wetland, or floodplain areas on the property. There are no steep slopes on the property. You can tell from the aerial photo we looked at and from the road view that the parcel's fairly level. Next, we take a look at governmental agency review, and as of before the meeting, the Town of Hammond Town Board had not provided any specific recommendation for or against the rezoning application. At the bottom of the page, we have to take a look at the applicable statutes and criteria. And for a rezoning to be approved, it must be consistent with the comprehensive plan and town plans, with our natural resource management plan, with the county zoning ordinance. Another criteria is that the town has not disapproved the rezoning request, and that the rezoning and proposed use is consistent with the comprehensive plan and does not result in spot zoning. The options for the committee tonight would be to recommend approval to the board of the zoning amendment, recommend disapproval, or table the requests for additional information or discussion based on any public comments received tonight. Upon staff review of the request, the staff is recommending approval of the rezoning amendment for the 10.2 acres from R2 residential or to R2 residential, based on the findings that we've discussed earlier, that the future land use maps of both the town and the county support the rezoning request, that the town of Hammond has not disapproved the request, and that the use is consistent and can comply with the standards in Chapter 15 zoning ordinance. That concludes the brief overview, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
We'll hold the questions from the committee until we ask the audience if we have anybody who'd like to speak in favor, or anybody who'd like to speak opposed. Is there anybody in the audience who'd like to speak toward this rezoning? Okay. Just please give us your name, where you live, and
Sure. Yeah,
what you
I'm
have to
Troy
say.
Jensen. I'm a resident of Emerald Township. It's my mom's property. We just figured that it would be a good place to be able to put up some houses, be more consistent with what's going on in that neighborhood. And it seemed advantageous to her to be able to provide some more land for houses. One of the lots, we're looking at building a house for my sister on, so that would be personal. Obviously, it's not a town or county benefit necessarily, but a personal benefit as to why we would want to see that go through. And it would be nice to see the land being used a little bit more.
Thank you. All right, does anybody in the committee have a question? Sir.
John, maybe you can answer this question. I think it was last month this piece of property came up and then it was pulled off the agenda because the DOT had some questions. I'm guessing that's been solved, or what can you shed light on?
So last month, we were scheduled to have a hearing to rezone about 8 of the 10 acres to residential, and the proposal, let me get to the right slide here. So the proposal would have left Lot 1 as commercial. And so as I mentioned earlier, the certified survey map is a land division instrument that gets reviewed by different entities. Because this land division request abuts a state highway, the DOT needed to review that. And they said that if Lot 1 were to remain commercial, that the access to this lot would have to be 500 feet 500 feet east of this intersection. So that would have required that access to be moved about 150 to 200 feet further east, incurring costs for the development. And so I think after discussion between the owner and their surveyor, and I think our land division staff, they elected to go with this proposal. And if all the 4 lots are residential, the existing access can remain in place. However, one of the caveats from DOT was that when the village expands to the south, kind of where my cursor is, they're going to require an easement be platted between Lot 3 and 4, so this development can connect to the south, and then ultimately this access to Highway 12 gets eliminated. So that, to make a long story short, that's kind of the gist of what was discussed. And so that's why the rezoning was withdrawn last month.
Right.
The applicant wanted a little bit more time to think things through, and that's kind of how got to where we are today.
So with what you're saying, if you go back to that previous slide, currently the way that is, it's still a little bit in flux as far as how that would be adapted, because you'd still have to put the easement and things in there for the final subdivision portion approval. And I realize this is just for zoning purposes now, but this wouldn't be the end map. There'd end up being something a little bit different, because the other question would be there's no cul-de-sac or anything on here.
Correct. The certified survey map would be modified to reflect the DOT comments and requirements that I just talked about.
Committee satisfied? Is there anybody left in the audience who'd like to say a word? Sure.
My name is Paul Hugh. I am the town chair for the town of Hammond. And at this point, also, as it reflected, the town is not opposed to this rezoning. I do have a copy of an updated survey map. I don't have it for up there, but if you want to look at it to see their proposed easement from the DOT, then I can let you have it. Oh, all right. Yeah, you know how to do it better than I do. And so then the town's position is that with the work that John and his people have done, and with the work that the DOT has done, and what they're requiring the landowner to do, that we feel confident that the town will be protected. So you can see where they've proposed that other easement to go to the end of the property between lots 3 and 4, in the event that there'd be development on that south end at some point. That works pretty good. Yeah. That's all I've got.
Paul, can we ask you one question?
Yeah, you bet. Okay. Scott, go ahead.
So Paul, as we're looking at that, that's the only question I still have is if this is closer to being final, will they be doing something yet on the end of that for, because you're going to need a bigger circumference of that for the
line, this area here will just be set aside. Yeah. I guess as far as this part, which will be permanent, or the existing access, the town has expressed that we will not be maintaining that road. We won't be plowing it. We won't be doing anything with that road. It's too small, and the way it's set up, we're not going to adopt that. So we could certainly recommend that a temporary cul-de-sac be put there, but with that being said, the fact that we don't have county equipment in there, I don't know that we really need to allow for a cul-de-sac. We do have buses that stop on 12 to pick up kids for school. It's less than half a mile, so by that requirement, you know, the kids, if there are kids there, would be able to walk out to 12 or somewhere close to 12 in which to access a bus. So again, a cul-de-sac would more than likely not be necessary. So we are not requiring it at this time.
Real good. Thank you.
Okay.
Paul, we appreciate you bringing that.
All right. Thank you.
All right, is there anybody else from the audience who'd like to say a word for or against this rezoning? That being the case, we'll close this public hearing, and we'll move into business item number 1, which is talking about actually passing this rezoning, and I would entertain a motion.
I'd make a motion to approve the rezoning request to rezone 10.2 acres from commercial 1 commercial district to the R2 residential district for Jensen in the town of Hammond.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Do we have any further discussion? Let's put her to a vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. None opposed, passes unanimously. Thank you very much. We're going to move into public hearing number 2, which is the Trumbull and Croix in the town of Emerald. And John again. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Good evening again, Mr. Chair and committee members. The second public hearing tonight is a rezoning application by John Trumbull and Judy Croix in the town of Emerald. Specifically, we're looking at trying to rezone property from R1 to R2 and R2 to R1. Both applicants, the co-applicants, currently own separate parcels of land in the town of Emerald with different zoning designations. The applicants desire to exchange portions of their properties in order to resolve a building encroachment issue. And I will forward to a map here. So right now we have parcel number 1 that's currently owned by Trumbull. The area in here is owned by Ms. Croix. You can see the building encroachment owned by Croix that's on the Trumbull property. So Croix would get parcel 1, and in exchange, Croix would deed property in this parcel 2 area of about 0.297 acres. So because both parcels are different zoning, they need to go through the rezoning process to rectify the discrepancy. Again, showing the location area a few miles northwest of Glenwood City, kind of on the edge of the old plat of the original town of Emerald. Here's a better look at the aerial photo. You can see the subject encroachment right in here. And again, this parcel is owned by the Croix. And the parcel down here is Trumbull's. Again, just to look at surrounding zoning, you kind of see the old platted lots within the old town plat. Parcel 1, parcel 2. Parcel 1 is currently R1, and parcel 2 is currently R2. So to do the exchange, we have to swap the zoning. A little bit of background within Emerald. Some of these homes are serviced by the Emerald Glenwood Sanitary District Number 1 through a stabilization pond seepage cell system located north of the village plat area. So if you were wondering about how some of this density was being serviced, in the general town area, it's being serviced by a sanitary district system. Again, as with the previous application, we take a look at the comprehensive plans of both the town and the county. And at the point of the blue arrow is where the subject properties are located. And you can see here that this area is guided for future residential development. Likewise with the county land use plan, it's kind of smaller, but you can see the blue highlighted area. The county also guides this area for future residential, so we don't really see any conflicts with the change of zoning before you tonight. Next, we take a look at the natural resource features. We do have an environmental corridor designated in the properties, and that pretty much follows this blue line here, which is designated as an intermittent stream. So this stream is more active during spring and wet events, but it is not a permanent stream. Oops. We do have some scattered wetlands on the site. We also have some smaller floodplain areas. As noted previously, an intermittent stream flows along the site. Because there's really no development involved with this swap, we're not really going to talk about impacts to natural resources and what ordinances would apply. The parcel does contain some small areas of steeper slopes of 12 to 20% and 20%. And again, because there's no development, we're not going to point out the different features relative to that. Next, we take a look at governmental agency review. The Town Board of Emerald met on September 13th to discuss this request, and they are recommending to the committee tonight approval of the rezoning application. Like the other application, we cite the applicable statutes and criteria consistent with the county comp plan, natural resource plan, zoning ordinance, that the town has not disapproved the request. The rezoning does not result in spot zoning and is consistent with surrounding land uses. Again, the items and actions before the committee tonight would be to recommend approval, disapproval, or table if you have questions or you get additional testimony tonight. So based on staff review and the town board review, we would recommend approval of the request from R1 to R2 and R2 to R1. We would cite that the future land use plan maps of both the town and the county would support the rezone requests, that the town of Emerald has recommended approval request, and that the use is consistent with and can comply with Chapter 15. And that concludes the staff overview.
Very good. Again, I'll ask if there's anybody here who'd like to speak in favor of this rezoning. Please come to the podium and tell us who you are and say your piece.
I'm the fortunate John Tembrell who has somebody build a pole barn on his land and gets to do all the work for it, and he sits at home. But anyway, I'll have to get over the fact that it's been done, but I do want to get it resolved and taken care of. It's just a shame that they couldn't have got caught when the permit was taken, but no one takes responsibility for that, of course. So that's what we got. Take care of it.
So you're not opposing this?
I am not opposing it because I just didn't think it should cost me money to have this done, but that's how it's going to turn out. A guy builds a pole barn on your land and you get to do all the work to get it straightened out.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. It's been a long process, but
You have my empathy. Anybody else like to make a comment about this rezoning? You have any questions from the committee? Scott?
You know, I listen to what you're saying on that. Now, in the end here, do you own the property then that's adjacent to the south of that building?
Oh, you step up to the podium,
I should have asked why he's up there.
yeah, I own south, the farmland south of it.
And then you
South of
will,
the creek. I own all that, so it's like a total of 60 acres in there.
so the where it says unplatted land there, do you own that piece?
South of the building is Coyer's.
South of the building?
South of the building is Coyer's property.
That's
That's
Coyer's
Coyer's?
property. Yeah, that's Coyer's.
And then north, well, the building itself is Coyer's?
No, it's, well, if you see that little line there,
Yes.
That's his, he owns like 4 or 5 feet of the building. If
I'm sorry, I'm trying to, I'm trying to picture here if, in the end here, if the same owner of the building owns the entire property of the building, or is this
he will once it's-
subdividing the building?
So Coyer owns this. And Coyer's building is shown here, and the majority of it encroaches onto the, one of the Coatembral's property. So the exchange would allow parcel 1 to be conveyed to Coyer. And in exchange, Coyer would deed to Tembral parcel number 2, which is down here.
Okay. Okay, so actually it cleans it up so that
Yes.
Coyer will own all of it.
And then the creek is like the property line.
Okay. Thank you, that helps.
Thank you, sir.
Yep.
All right. Any further questions from the committee? Any further questions or comments from the audience? This closes the public hearing. We'll move into the business item number 2, and I'll entertain a motion. Sean?
I'll move to approve the rezoning requests in the town of Emerald.
Very good. Do we have a second? We have a second. Do we have any further discussion? No. Seeing none, we'll vote. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. That'll pass unanimously. Thank you very much. We're going to move into public hearing number 3, request to zone the Fern property in Baldwin. John?
Our final public hearing tonight is a rezoning application by Mr. Gary Fern for property at 2398 90th Avenue in the town of Baldwin. Instead of going through the narrative, I'm just going to forward right to the proposed certified survey map. So what we have is parcel 1 and parcel 2, both of which are currently zoned agriculture 1 within the town of Baldwin. And what the applicant desires to do is to rezone parcel 1, which is 35.57 acres, to Ag 2. This would grant them an additional building eligibility with a 1 unit per 20 acres limit in the Ag 2 district. In addition to that, the applicant desires to add 0.95 acres, shown as parcel number 2, and the applicant would like to add that to existing homestead right here, which is about 1.5 acres. Parcel 2 is about 0.95 acres. So what that does is it brings this lot, this home, into conformance with the 2-acre lot minimum. And also on parcel 2, there's an accessory building that would be attached to the original homestead lot. And again, this would be zoned to R1. So again, the summary is Ag 1 to Ag 2 for the 35.57 acres and 0.95 acres to go to R1, shown on parcel 2 and attached to the existing lot. Next, we'll just go through some location maps. The subject property is located in the town of Baldwin, as I mentioned, north of the villages of Woodville and Baldwin. Here's kind of an aerial photo, predominantly agriculturally utilized. You see the shed here, which was shown in parcel 2, that comprises the 0.95 acres and would be added to the existing 1.5 acre homestead. The red dots you see is just the border of the subject property. Again, panning out a little bit further, the subject property is in blue, and of course in the town of Baldwin, it's predominantly agriculture. Again, the zoning map and surrounding uses of surrounding properties, everything in green is Ag 1. We do have some R1 zone parcels that represent scattered home sites within the town. And then on this site right here is the location of the Baldwin Town Hall, just south of the subject site. Again, as I mentioned earlier, rezoning requests must comply with the comprehensive plan of the jurisdictions consistent with state statute. We took a look at the town of Baldwin future land use plan map, and they promote this area as mixed rural and rural residential, which basically supports agriculture and some scattered low-density rural residential development that does not negatively impact prime farmland. And the St. Croix County future land use plan primarily mirrors that. We show that as agriculture. The primary intent of the ag area is to preserve productive ag lands, promote further investment in farming, and limit residential development to 1 unit per 20 acres or 1 unit to 40 acres. And again, the applicant is seeking the 1 unit per 20 acres through the ag zoning district. Natural resource features, we do not show any significant resource features being impacted by the rezoning. Again, the subject property highlighted in blue. We do not have any shoreland, wetland, or floodplain areas on the parcel. And again, based on our soil mapping, you can see that the soil out there is very conducive for productive ag land. Governmental agency review. At the town board meeting of Baldwin, they reviewed the request and on August 7th recommended approval of the request. Again, I won't go through the criteria. If you have questions, we can certainly address those. And again, the applicable statutes and criteria, the different options the committee has tonight based on any public comment, recommend approval, disapproval, or table for additional information. Following staff review, we would be recommending approval of the rezoning changes based on the town of Baldwin and St. Croix County Comprehensive Plan. The future land use maps would support the proposed change in ordinance designations. The town board of Baldwin has recommended approval, that the proposed use is consistent with and comply with Chapter 15 zoning. And because we're going to be rezoning a small sliver of that land out of the ag district, we're required by the State Department of Ag, Trade and Consumer Protection to document the reasons why we're going to be rezoning that parcel out of agriculture. And basically, the responses are that the land is better suited for a use not allowed in the farmland preservation zoning district. And basically what we're saying is that the parcel seeking to be rezoned is already occupied with an existing accessory structure that we showed you in the aerial photo, and that area is not being farmed or used for grazing. The rezoning is consistent with the town of Baldwin and St. Croix County comprehensive plans. There's also a provision that talks about the rezoning being consistent with county certified farmland preservation areas. And again, this rezoning is not converting any land being used for ag purposes, such as livestock, crop, or forage production. And that the rezoning will not substantially impair or limit abutting parcels to conduct their ag uses. And again, the adjacent parcels being utilized for ag would not be impacted or encroached upon. So again, we're asking you to incorporate that in your findings, and that concludes our review of the request.
Very good, thank you, John. Is there anybody here from the public who'd like to speak for or against this rezoning? Does the committee have any questions? None? Pretty straightforward. One more time I'll ask, is there anybody here from the audience who'd like to speak toward this rezoning? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing for this, and we'll move into business item number 3, and I would entertain a motion.
I make a motion that we amend the comprehensive zoning ordinance, section 16, township 29N, range 16, town of Baldwin, rezoning 35.56 acres from Ag 1 agricultural district to Ag 2 agriculture district, and rezoning 0.952 acres from Ag 1 to R1 residential district.
Very good. Do we have a second? I have a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. There are no nays. Passes unanimously. Thank you. At this point,
Thank you.
thank you. At this point, we're going to change the agenda. I should have announced this earlier. I apologize. I'd like to take item number 6 and move it up. We're going to take it next, which is the discussion and update on accessory dwelling units. So thank you for your forbearance.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. So at the August 17th CDC meeting, you guys brought up the topic of accessory dwelling units. And after that meeting, our staff and our department went through and looked at the American Planning Association documents, also the American Association of Retired Persons websites, for some guidance. We also looked at accessory dwelling units that were being handled in Pierce County and Goodhue County, Minnesota, just for some examples. And in my past, and maybe this has been handled a little bit differently here, but staff's role is not to create policy, but to take and bring suggestions to the committees for certain provisions and conditions. And that hopefully makes your job easier so that you can, amend conditions or approve conditions on the floor. If there's something that's totally out of whack, you can always direct staff to go back and try another chance at it. So what we've come up with here is some sample provisions. There's definitely some arbitrary numbers in here that could be amended. We had several public comments on it as well. Any of these amendments, in order to make them ordinance, would require going through the public hearing process. So looks like Julie's got it up on the board there. At the August CDC meeting, John had went through and did a nice a PowerPoint presentation on the various types of accessory dwelling units. One, that they can be attached to the building. They might be able to be detached from the building. They might even be incorporated within the dwelling unit, like above or below the main dwelling. So that's what provision A is regarding. Provision B is to only allow 1 ADU permitted per parcel. I think that would be something that could be a good provision to have, so that you have a total number of them. Provision C, this is one that is arbitrary. In no case shall the ADU exceed 1,000 square feet of finished living space. Now, the finished living space there, maybe it's a detached building and maybe they've got a garage space on the bottom level, and that it's our interpretation that finished living space would only be like the finished dwelling area that may be on the second floor of that building. The ADU must meet setbacks for the zoning district that it's located in and within 100 feet of the principal residential structure. Now, the 100 feet there, that was something that we've seen in other counties in that for rules. Generally, these ADUs, the desire is to use some of the public facilities that are already there or the private facilities like water, for example. So we thought that was a reasonable condition, but of course that could be changed. And then the max height that we've got currently is 35 feet. So just clarifying that that would be the same. Off-street parking is already in our county ordinances and already required. We just thought that you would have that as a provision just to make sure that there's sufficient parking on site. Provision G was brought up in public comment. This was something that staff had quite a bit of conversation with on whether or not it's the goal of the county to be able to keep these all on one parcel. And then as we talked about it more, we're like, well, if it meets all the requirements to normally be subdivided out, and if it meets uniform dwelling code, which you'll see is one of our conditions below, and it's got sewer and everything, as long as all that's able to be, compliant,
why wouldn't we allow it to be split out, you know? So that's what provision G is there. If the committee wanted to change that to meet all St. Croix County and local regulations, I think that's something that could be definitely added. H is basically on the ownership of the property, and the thought, and maybe the committee's okay with this, but maybe you're not. If somebody is a developer and they buy a piece of property and they don't live on site, an accessory dwelling unit, if they wanted to rent out both buildings, then it would be almost like a duplex type of scenario. Then provision I was also mentioned briefly, but that has to do with the short-term rental, Airbnb. The health department calls them tourist rooming houses. And after talking with Heather, our corporation counsel, the right to rent law is basically what we've got there that allows the committee to establish a minimum rental period of a maximum of 7 days, which is what it is. If the committee wanted to make that 2 days, they could do that. Also, the committee can take and limit the amount of rental to 180 days per year. Now that can be consecutive or it doesn't have to be consecutive. That is up to the committee. Consecutive from an administration standpoint is easier to tell, because then if they tell us that we're going to start renting it April 1st, we know October 1st it's done, versus trying to track 180 days throughout the whole year. The separate entrance and address, we were talking about addressing of these, and if it's located within the building, you know, then a simple Unit A or Unit B address might be sufficient. And that kind of goes back up to that 100 feet. If we go much farther than that, then we're starting to think, do we need to assign double addresses so that we can have a structure point on both buildings? Now, with the new NG 911 standards, they're moving to the address points being not only the access point of where the driveway hits the road, but also on the buildings. So if you have, you know, a quarter of a mile and that between the two, and we got Unit A and Unit B, it may be very confusing for any responders to find which is which. The ADU would have either its own septic, or it would have a septic that is sized appropriately for both the dwelling and the ADU. So the thought is, right now, if you have an accessory building and you've got capacity to hook it into your existing sewer because you oversized your sewer when you put it in, that we would still allow that. However, if you have a 3-bedroom house and a 3-bedroom sewer, and now you want to put in a 2-bedroom ADU, and that would need to take and either have its own sewer, which we would allow with the way that this is written, or the main sewer would have to be updated so that they cannot be on an undersized system. I did skip over D there because of that. D is talking about the 2 bedrooms and the maximum occupancy of 4 people. That is tied into the sewer system because the state and the sanitary code says that 1 bedroom is good for 2 people. So that's where our occupancy of 4 comes. But of course, the 2 bedrooms, that's arbitrary and something that the committee could decide. Provision M, that one also could be an interesting point for you guys. Of course, since 2005, the state adopted the Uniform Dwelling Code, and a lot of towns adopted that in 2003 and 2004, but it was mandatory January 1st, 2005. So any building that's built since then that we're going to have human habitation in has to meet the Uniform Dwelling Code. So that kind of makes sense here. The reason why we included that as a provision is in case somebody's got an existing accessory building and they want to convert it into an ADU, that building probably wasn't built to code. So now, as far as enforcement, we can go back and make sure that they've met code requirements before we permit it as an ADU. This provision here is more about the community and the looks. A lot of ADUs may be just a simple manufactured home that they move in for a short period of time. But we threw it in there as an option, again, that if the committee didn't want manufactured homes as an ADU, that you could require a building that met the Uniform Dwelling Code. Okay. And then just so future owners are aware of these standards, the last provision is just simply affidavit to be filed on the deed of the property so that any future owners have that knowledge going into their purchase of what it is versus thinking that it's a full 2 dwellings on the property. With that, John also pointed out there's some areas in the ordinance that we would have to add these in. So that is what is mentioned here in these 4 bullet points. And we would have to create a definition of an accessory dwelling unit, which we've currently got a dwelling unit that is accessory to a principal residential structure and is on the same lot as the primary residential structure. So, and that is different than our current dwelling provision. So that's what I've got. I guess as staff, we're looking for the committee's blessing to move forward, or we're looking for any amendments that the committee would like to make, kind of some direction on how to proceed. As I mentioned, we would have to schedule this for a public hearing, which could be done at probably the November meeting for the CDC.
Let's have some conversation here. Let's start here.
Well, the first one is just be careful on the where you have the manufactured housing disallowance. There's a lot of protective measures from the state regarding that, where you have to look at potentially a different way if you're, I understand what you're trying to do with that, but they have a lot of protective laws for those, so you have to be careful about how you word that and how you do it. The second thing is, I guess a suggestion if we're thinking about this is it really impacts the people, especially in the towns. And I think getting out and getting, before we consider public hearings or moving the next step for that, I think getting it out for a hearing or doing a towns association meeting or something where we can get some first feedback and let everybody know what's going on with this so that they have an opportunity to get a heads up and they're not caught off guard to all of a sudden they got to come to a public hearing and have a bunch of stuff. So the more input we get, it's going to make it easier for you also to forge ahead with your job.
I guess maybe at this point for staff direction, can we just go through it line by, like section by section? Would that be helpful?
Before we do that, I'd like to make the point that we have to have an up or down vote whether or not we're going to pursue this, and I don't want to get the cart before the horse and do technical planning before we actually decide whether or not we're going to do it. We have to have a concept before we have a proof of concept. And I think what Scott's saying is we should probably slow down a bit, take her on out to the townships, talk to the people who actually have to live with it, and ask them what they think, and then come back and we can talk about if we still think we want to do it, then talk about it in some detail. That's kind of what I'm thinking. Sean, what's on your mind?
I don't disagree with that. With the earliest time of being available for public hearing for this being November, I think if it's done by February or March, so people can plan to do it in the spring, and we'd be okay. You know, And then I guess just a general comment, if we make an associations of towns meeting the next one, like a voluntary committee meeting so that we can all show up there and it's declared in public, that would be great.
Well, you're saying have us overlap our committee meeting with the town association meeting and show up and be available for them to visit with?
I think just, even if it's just like a committee of the whole, but we're just basically saying, well, that a quorum of community development members will be maybe at the Association of Towns
That's a
meeting.
fantastic idea, Sean. Paul, when's your next meeting?
It will be the last Thursday of October. I don't know if that's, I've got it here. So either the 26th or the 27th. It'll be the 26th of October at the Baldwin Highway Department building at 6:30.
How does the committee feel about that?
Yeah, I know. We'll make it.
Yeah, it's no problem, and that way we can just take and do a notice and that there might be a quorum of the Community Development Committee members present at that
I
meeting.
think,
The towns would get noticed as part of the public hearing process, but that's probably at the 11th hour, and that, so it would be nice to give them more time. And I, as staff, and that plan on going out and doing, a town's tour and that, after we're through our busy season and I get a little more time underneath my belt here. And that's how I was planning like December, January, February to start doing that, which just would be one thing that I could bring up at those meetings.
So this would be this would be a second meeting of the Community Development Committee. The standard meeting will be October 19th, and then the next week we'll have a subsequent meeting.
Yeah, and then I think it'd be good too for us to maybe discuss our initial thoughts today, maybe not anything in stone, but like a thumbs up, thumbs down kind of thing today. And then we could bring that to the Association of Towns meeting, have it be an agenda item that they can review then.
Okay. At this point, I guess I'm going to take a poll in general. How are you feeling about it, Sean? I'm going to do it one at a time. If you're gonna vote today, how would you feel in general, without any real detail? How would you feel about changing the zoning code and allowing accessory structures?
In general, I'm in favor of it, especially with the obvious considerations for septic that are written in there.
All right, and we know that you're standing for it. Jerry?
I would support it also, but I think we do have to go through some of these. There's changes that need to be made, and we have to be open to that. And if the right changes were made, I think it would be viable.
Scott, how are you feeling about it?
Yes, potentially in favor, but I think as I was listening to the town's concerns, I think also ensuring that we have mechanisms in place that if we're going to do something like this, that in the end, we have a means to be able to control how it's being done and to police it.
And I'm not afraid of telling you that I'm opposed to it in general, unless we can come up with something much different, and exactly for the reason that when we talked about it, was it back in 2016 or maybe it was 2020, we rolled it out as a concept draft to the towns, and there was so much opposition by the town boards that we took it off. We being the committee, we removed it because they were so opposed. So I would be inclined to not support it because we've already been down that road in recent history. But if my colleagues are wanting to pursue this, then I say we'll have a go at it and turn to our fellow elected officials and ask them to consider it and see what happens. Sean?
And maybe there are things, not maybe, there will be ideas at the Association of Towns meeting that'll make it palatable for, most people that maybe I can't even think of right now, and everyone has a different idea, but if there's, certain restrictions or something that 80% of people can buy into, then I think it's worth looking into.
And I know that this committee can make a zoning rule that we can impose on townships. I know that we can, but I'm proud that we've always respected the towns enough not to do that, and I would, yeah, okay, good. All right, moving forward, I think that we've got a course in front of us that's respectful and clearly marked, and I appreciate your cooperation, so thank you very much for coming. All right, we're going to go back to our original, we're going to talk about, where am I? The old number 4, oh, sir, I'm sorry.
So if we're gonna go to the township meeting, I think we need to have this list a little better defined. If we present them with this, I wouldn't vote for this. I'm sorry.
Oh.
I think we should go through it to give staff some direction so that they can have something for them at that meeting.
Oh, if we were going to refine this, then I'd almost want to have a subcommittee to do that kind of work. That gets into the kind of detail I wasn't planning on having at this committee meeting. This was going to be a conversation, not a work session.
I guess maybe we just go through.
We can do it.
Or just ask the quick changes that.
Yeah, let's do that.
Considering.
I guess I can see that. Let's take that.
Maybe not go through it line item by line item, but there's changes that Supervisor Shirley is suggesting.
Go ahead. Let's have it.
All right. First would be the zoning districts. I see some benefit in having this in the ag districts too. I'm not sure why we're restricting it to R1 and R2. So, yeah.
If I can answer that real quickly, we did contact the Department of Ag, Trade and Consumer Protection after our last meeting. And we asked them if we could do accessory dwelling units in the ag districts. Again, in order to maintain their tax credit status in the certified ag districts, they cannot exceed the base density of 1 per 20 in the ag 2 and the base density of 1 unit per 40 acres in the ag 1. So DATCAP would consider that an additional unit that would have to meet density standards. So that is the primary reason why we left it out of the ag districts, just FYI.
So just to clarify, basically the only thing that would be allowed is an attached accessory dwelling unit, in which case is just an addition, more or less.
Under the current ag standards, we could allow it as a conditional use as a 2-family dwelling. And we already have provisions for that. So we don't have to change or add anything to the ag districts relative to the ADUs. So I think we're good with the ag districts.
My next comment would be on 3A, with it being, I think we need to come up with a better definition, because our definition on page 2 doesn't match up with our definition under number A. I think, like you just said, if we were going to be in attached, it's basically an addition. We already have that covered. I think we should, I personally think that we should keep this as a detached version of that, otherwise, or figure out something that. Yeah, but it says detached or attached to the principal structure. If we had an attached to the structure, it's just an addition to their existing structure. Why do we need to call it an AUD? Or ADU?
So the primary difference with that, under the current zoning code, a twin family or a 2-family dwelling requires a conditional use permit. So that's a public hearing with our Board of Adjustment. Under what we're proposing, the ADU standards and how we define what an AD unit is, if you meet the criteria, you could apply for a land use permit, which is an administrative approval. So you would not be going to the Board of Adjustment. So that's kind of how we differentiate an ADU versus a twin family dwelling, 2-family dwelling.
Yeah. Okay. under C, the square footage, I guess I would think about that a little bit more. I think 1,000 square feet is, I don't know where we want to make that mark. I think 1,000, if you're looking at an accessible area for maybe seniors, if you have accessible bathrooms and maybe lifts in there and everything else, 1,000's pretty tight. I think we could do more than that, or we could do a percentage of the main principal structure. But something to think about there. And I don't know if we should necessarily define in D a maximum bedrooms. If you have the maximum square footage, what's the difference at that point, other than septic, which would be approved in that later anyway, so.
So let's have a conversation about that. What is your intention? If we put another house out there with 1,800 square feet, 2,500 square feet, and 6 bedrooms, call it an ADU, we're pricing that property so high, it becomes, you know, we are creating something that's no longer an accessory unit. We're building another very expensive house.
That's why I think if you have it as a percentage of square foot of the main house, or we make something, but I think we have to be more than 1,000 square feet. That was just my point on that. Whether it's 1,500 max or 1,300, 1,200, I think it has to be more than 1,000.
Well, let's take a look at the ADA. Let's take a look at the ADA and see what we need to have for minimum square feet for wheelchair for a 2-bedroom facility, and I want to keep them small. I don't think there's intention here to build luxury properties.
No, that's true.
Mr. Chair, I
So that's something
can
to talk about.
add to, in that a lot of the ones that we looked at ranged anywhere from 600 to 1,200 square feet. So that's kind of why we ended up where we were. Polka's 1,000 as well, and I'm not sure that the ADA is going to come out and tell us a total square footage. A lot of times, in that it's more specific to the doorway width or a hallway width, or and that having accessible ramps if needed. So I'm not sure that we're going to get a lot of help on determining what that size is, but maybe that we'll have a consensus come back from the towns too. So
Yep.
All right. Let's let the square footage hang until we talk to people in the townships, maybe. All right, Sean, or go ahead.
Comment on the thing he was talking about with that. One of the things, you're bringing up is amount of bedrooms and things, but I think that's also coming in with one of the concerns that when I say the towns have had, where they're concerned about that this doesn't turn, where these don't turn into large additional family units or something where they have, they're rural or they're setting up for multiple families or things that are moving into this one unit and having a whole lot of people in an area, because then all of a sudden then you're putting a burden on them septic systems and everything else, because and with this, it's kind of dictating, okay, you can have 4 people. So it's a control measure for that type of thing. And I think our main principal goal was for having extended family members and things like that, and the place for mom and dad to retire, whatever. But it's and not to have it necessarily for multifamily.
I would look at E as well, with 100 feet to the principal structure. We may have properties that don't have buildable areas within 100 feet, but that restriction could potentially have some issues there too. we've already heard the concerns about H. I'm not sure how I stand on that yet. I had a question about J with the addresses. Would they come, is 911 gonna require a totally different number? Or are they gonna go AB? Because if you go AB, then now you're asking the principal to change their address as well.
Or could you have just a number and A on the second?
The goal, I believe, would be to have a separate address for a separate structure.
Separate number.
Yeah, but there is issues where you can take and get, so that you don't get enough numbers in this particular area, so we run short, so.
Okay. Right. Okay.
Also, can we go back to I? If these structures are built for the purpose of renting them, I'd like to build into the code that there's some revenue that comes back out of that, something similar to a room tax, so that we can return that to the townships or return that to the fire districts, the sheriff's department or whatever, for buffer against emergency services.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Septic, I personally, especially on some of these sites, if we're going R1 and R2, I'd rather, I think Scott would probably share in this, that it would rather be a shared system rather than a whole separate system for that. And it's going to be cheaper for them to upgrade their existing service most of the time than to put a new one in anyway. So having that, some of those in there about, there was one about that wouldn't necessarily, if they're tied together, then we wouldn't necessarily need to have that one about the being able to sell, because they wouldn't be able to sell separately, or some of that. The building permits, I understand what you're saying on compliance with the uniform code. I think that maybe we tie it to a certificate of occupancy rather than, maybe that would make more sense.
Say that again, please. I'm not sure actually what you meant.
Under M, we're talking about the uniform building code, whether if they had an older structure, having to update that to be current with the code. And then I would also agree with Scott that we have to be really careful on that manufactured home. I think that strictly excluding them or prohibiting them may not be the right answer. But I understand what you're trying to do there. But maybe we try to leave that to covenants of neighborhoods or whatnot for that.
Well, I do know that town leaders had a fairly strong feeling about rolling in the manufactured homes. It was something that they just didn't like the image of. We want to preserve the property values, and seeing these things put on the front corner of lots is not something they wanted to see.
There's a way you have to do it though. You have to do it a different way though, because I think the state is, the statutes protect manufactured housing. So you have to, there's very specific ways you have to look at detailing that. So I've kind of seen this in the past.
And one way to do that would be require it to be attached to the present dwelling. Requiring this to be attached to the present dwelling, that would not leave room for manufactured housing, which I'm okay without.
All right, we roll this out to the town leaders, and we'll see what they think.
So we have another community development meeting right before the town's meeting. So do you want staff to redo then based upon this input, bring that back to the next community development, and then from that meeting, take it to the towns, but that's only 1 week in between? What are your thoughts?
Thank you for the suggestion. I think it's a good idea.
Okay.
Yeah, if after that review of the next one, if we can immediately get it to them to give them the maximum amount of notice so they get a chance to kind of read it before the meeting would be great. So they're not getting their first eyes on it the night that we're bringing it to them.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll see how good Jason is reading between the lines. I'm hearing everything and I'm picking up because I know some of you, but we'll see how good Jason is at this so far.
Right, I'm going to say my opposition to this thing isn't necessarily born of my own deepest held opinions. It's being a realist and knowing what they want in the township. And I also know that we've had townships withdraw from county zoning, and I'd like to avoid that happening again if possible. Absolutely. So, any other thoughts? Sir?
So if more than 50% of the townships say we don't want this, what are we going to do?
Well, I think we should just not do it.
Okay, well, I just, we have to be ready for that.
Well,
Or the other way.
I'm only one vote, Jerry.
I know it, but we as a committee have to be ready to address that if that.
We put it to a vote, and if the committee, I will honor the decision of the body. And if the committee votes, send it to the county board votes to do it, then we will force our will on the townships and let the chips fall where they may. I would hate to see that happen personally, and I would recommend against it.
Mr. Chairman?
Sir?
There's also available by state statute, towns can submit a protest petition for towns under county zoning if they are not in favor of a proposed amendment that the committee or board is proposing. If a majority of them submit a resolution stating that, that ordinance will not pass. So just FYI.
Yeah, I think we want to avoid, this township can do it and this township cannot do it and this one can and that cannot. I think we should go either dive in or stay on the shore.
I think Sean's recommendation of going to the meeting shows that we're wanting to communicate, we're wanting to participate in a good relationship. And if we come out of that with a strong please don't, we'll have our marching orders. And we're all reasonable people. So let's take her from there. Are we ready to move on? Anybody need a break? Moving forward. Sean, that was a no? Okay. Okay. Here we go. Business item number 5 is a resolution ordering the dissolution of the Upper Willow River Rehabilitation District, and Jason will take it.
All right, yeah, so this is something that we don't see many of, but the Upper Willow River Rehab District has not been active since 2016. And the statute provides a process to dissolve a rehab district like this. And so Mark Kearns filed a petition to dissolve. The rehab district had an annual meeting on July 24th, 2023, and they voted to dissolve the rehab district. So that requires approval by the county committee here to formally dissolve that.
So this rehab district has a long history. It was formed in 1981 in New Richmond. Specifically, the map was drawn more of a political map than a watershed map. Taxed once, raised enough money to dredge the widespread New Richmond. They purchased a piece of land to put the leavings of the dredging on, which then they sold to the school district and made quite a profit on. The district was able to take the proceeds of that sale, and over the course of a long period of time, until 2016, use that for environmental projects within the watershed, wisely and under some excellent guidance before I was involved. Dispersed those funds. And as the funds went down, they just decided they're never going to tax again. That was their intention. In 2016, the last of the funds were donated and ended up becoming part of the money that went to the 10 Mile Creek project. There's less than $300 left in the account. The watershed district decided that would go to the farmer-led coalition once the judge gives the okay that it can be dispersed. It's not something that was taken lightly, but because of the origins of the district and because the map was drawn more politically than for the purposes of the watershed, in the history, it's felt by the people who live in the district. There's a very strong feeling, going all the way back to 1981, that it was perhaps not, it wasn't well received by the people all the way up in Forest, that they were dredging the widespread enrichment. And it would be not well received at all had they stayed active and tried to levy a tax again. So I feel I am the chair of that district, so I won't be voting on this measure. But I have shepherded this through and feel that it's the right thing to do. So, having said that, I'm going to turn this over to my vice chair and ask you to handle taking the vote, and I'm just going to sit back and you'll consider me an abstention for this.
So do we have a motion?
So moved.
So we have a motion then to dissolve the Willow River Watershed District.
Need a second.
For Upper Willow River, thank you, Watershed District.
Need a second.
Do we have a second? Okay. Any discussion? So all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Unanimous. And one abstention.
Thanks very much. I actually feel a little bit emotional about that, but it was the right thing to do. Moving on, a report for the Highway 35 off-road bicycle trail. So John's handling that. Thank you, John.
Mr. Chair, committee members, this is more of an update for your information. We are not seeking any action by you tonight. As you recall, earlier this year, we talked about the funding agreement in place for the Highway 35 off-road trail. As you recall, the county received an 80% TAP grant for the project costs, with the county contributing 20%. The numbers you see up on the overhead are the original funding agreement numbers. And I think what we talked about earlier this year is that the federal contribution will not change. And earlier this year, we talked about, is that better? Yep. And so we got direction from the committee to proceed with plans and specifications. We're getting to the point now where we got DOT approval for that, and we're approaching the time where we're going to be advertising for bids soon. One of the things we want to remind the committee on is that because we were using federal funds, we just want to point out that if the project does not move forward, the county would have to reimburse DOT approximately $95,000 for the engineering contract. And so the direction was to advertise for bids. We're going to do that in the month of October. We're going to be opening the bids in early November so that we will be able to report to you at your November CDC meeting. And earlier this year, we estimated with inflation and increased costs that the project was going to come in over bid based on the 2021 estimates. So we're kind of coming full circle. We're going to be advertising for bids, opening the bids, and then we anticipate bringing that information to you at your November meeting. The one thing I would also like to point out is that we did attach a schedule for the advertising. We'll be advertising during the month of October, bid opening November 2nd. We do the analysis and a report back. We don't have the date on here, but we will be reporting back to you at the third Thursday in November. We can analyze the bid costs then and see where we're at in terms of the project budget, and if we are overbid, We did build in a scenario too, where if the original estimate came in too high, we would have enough time to do another second advertisement. And that would take place in early January. And according to our engineer, there could be some differences between bidders putting in a bid in October versus January, depending on workloads and what kind of projects different contractors will be looking for. So again, we built in an alternate too. And we can get into that more in November when we take a look at the first round of bids. So again, just an update. We have the bidding dates. Next Monday, we'll receive the construction ID, which will be authorized by DOT, and that just allows us to advertise for bid. Whether we choose to accept the bids, and then we can go ahead and award the bid, get into a contract, and the construction ID allows us to move forward. So we'll be getting that Monday. Any questions?
I know we've talked about this before, I just don't remember the number, but you say in the summary, you say that the project estimate is slightly lower by 40,000, but still over. Do we know what that newest estimate number was over by?
We do kind of have some estimates. We're kind of trying to keep that lower profile. We don't want to get any numbers out there being so close to advertising for bids, but when we talked about this earlier this year, the project was over by about $180,000. That number has come down. Since then, we did another round of estimating about a month ago. And over the course of this year, according to our engineer, project costs have stabilized. It seems to be a better atmosphere for bidding projects. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah, really think about it this way. There's three possible outcomes. They bid it out and it's miraculously within budget. We have a $100,000 piece out of that that's already been authorized in the KIP. Staff can just award the contract then. If it's over budget, you will have two choices then left for you. One is you can reject it and we'll have a $95,000 cost, which is about the $100,000 we budgeted, but no project. We're just going to pay that back to the DOT. Or you're going to give us the additional funds, whatever that might be, over the $100,000 to complete the project. So it'll be an additional KIP allocation to get the project done. And it probably really just hinges on how close we come in. So if we're 10,000 over, do I think you guys would give it to us? Yeah, probably. If we're $500,000 over, do you think I can give it to us? Yeah, maybe not. So it's just how close they come.
Yeah. I guess my concern is that if we were 190,000 over before, you know, as a contractor, I'd hate to see everybody else just waste their time. We're not going to, as a board, I don't see us saying, yeah, here's an extra 90,000 so that we can do the project, where we could cut our losses at half of that. So I'm kind of torn on that one, whether we actually talk about it more before this goes out to bid.
So there's no additional cost for the county, really. I mean, we're talking a couple $1,000s, but there's no really any additional cost between now and getting the bids in and seeing what the price is.
Right.
There's
I'm
the
saying
work.
waste of time for the contractors and all bidding when we're not sure if we have the funds to actually do the project.
Yeah. Yep. But they might be within bid, within budget. There's always a chance.
I feel like, I feel like the contractors would always have to understand that a bid is kind of a crapshoot on whether they'll get it or not. It's just kind of part of the business, I would imagine. And we don't really know which way we're going to go until we have firm numbers in front of us.
Any other thoughts? John, thanks very much. We're going to move on. Number 7, a draft land use section of the comprehensive plan. So we're looking at Brett Boudreau.
Good evening, Chair Hansen and committee. Here to discuss the land use element, land use chapter of the comprehensive plan tonight. I want to review the draft with you. If you recall, we had 2 special meetings to review the land use in May and June. We reviewed the goals, objectives, and policies at that time, and you made suggested changes to those. We made those changes to the goals, objectives, and policies, and they are in this revised draft of the entire section. This is a clean draft of everything so that you can get a good look at everything in its format. So tonight I want to review the rest of the document, and we'll also review those goals, objectives, and policies. I'm going to highlight areas that we as staff we believe are important for you to look at, but I also want to recognize that this is a policy document of the county board and the committee. So if there are any recommendations, changes, additions, please make those and bring those forward. And also that while we call this a presentation, I'm looking to have a discussion or your opportunity to ask questions throughout or at the end at any time. Ask questions or make suggestions as we go through it. And there will also be ongoing review of the entire document as we continue with the other sections. This we feel is one of the priority sections for your review, but there might be information from some of the other elements or chapters that help inform this, and so we might end up circling back. In the document itself, we have an included table of contents for organization purposes, for you to review and for us as staff to review as we're going through. But in the ultimate final document, we'll remove that table of contents from each chapter element. There'll be one table of contents at the front of the entire document. I just wanted you to understand that as we go through that will change at some point. You'll have an opportunity to review the entire document. So as I said, here is our table of contents. I'm just going to go through the document and highlight the things that we believe are important. First page, we have the vision for the land use section. In 2035, St. Croix County values its historic roots in farming and natural resources. I'm not going to read all of this document. We'd be here much longer tonight. So this didn't change. We didn't make any changes to this. This is the land use vision from 2012. But I will talk a little bit about the introduction right here, this first paragraph. This land use section and the farmland preservation chapter are some of the most highly used chapters of the plan by staff when we make decisions. The zoning, rezonings that John does and presents, he reviews the land use element, the land use map, as well as town land use plans whenever we make these staff recommendations. So land use is a critical factor in managing the future growth of St. Croix County. Land use trends indicate what changes are occurring regarding type, location, and intensity of uses over time. It is these changes that should be managed in a manner that's beneficial to the residents and environment in St. Croix County. So then we'll just scroll down a little bit. As we all know and understand, the county's experienced dramatic residential growth, causing changes in land use in the western areas of the county and in proximity to the major highway corridors. The growth can have dramatic impact on communities. Development of productive farm or forest land can impact water resources, roads and schools, and can cause conflicts between farm and non-farm uses. So that's kind of just the beginning, the introductory chapter. And next I'm going to go into some of the findings and issues that we discussed at those earlier workshop meetings and highlight some of the important ones again that we as staff thought were important. The continuing conversion of farmland to other uses, number 3. Number 4, administering a county zoning ordinance for towns that have varying future land use maps and growth expectations. As we all know, we have a high level of growth on the west, not as much growth on the east. The demand is different. Land uses are different. So trying to acknowledge all of that and fit it into a comprehensive zoning ordinance is a challenge for the county. Number 6, even though we have seen tremendous residential growth and population growth, agriculture is the predominant land use, still the predominant land use. 58% of our land in the assessment and taxation categories, 245,000 acres is in agriculture. 245,000 acres is 371 square miles. So we are an agricultural county and community that is experiencing residential growth. Number 13, one of the things that we look at, 91% of the assessed residential acreage and 50% of the population are located in the rural towns. So much, and if this trend continues, it will have implications for our impacts on natural resource, productive lands, demand for services, and potential conflicts, and will be continuing to eat into that agricultural resource. Further down, number 16, the number of houses per 40 acres, the density decreases to less than 1 housing unit per 40 acres in the eastern half of the county. I highlight this one because 3 of our zoning districts use that measure as one of the zoning requirements, either 1 per 40, 2 per 40, or 4 per 40 in that density. And all of those zoning categories are actually higher than the existing density in some of those towns, which we'll see when we get to that mapping area. One of the things that we need to do or we want to talk about is what are some of the opportunities then that we recognize here in the land use area, or what are some of the changes, what's going to be coming forward. Number 1, we have a large supply of existing lots. As we develop, not all those lots get developed with homes, so there's a large existing lot inventory that could take up some of the demand and help us alleviate the conversion of property. Number 3, as we saw in the introduction chapter, issues and opportunities that we talked about last month, we're having a changing demographics in the county, across the country, in the state. We're aging with gray hair. So as that happens, some of these residents may prefer smaller lots and denser subdivisions to fit a changing lifestyle with greater access to services. So perhaps some of that development will come back to the villages and cities if they can handle that growth. Number 5, land use policies and regulations will need to address the variations in development pressure and type across the county. As we recognize, the west side of the county is different than the east. Balancing those uses is an important part of this process. And then number 7, after eliminating land with physical limitations, meaning slope, wetlands, water, poor soil conditions, there remains approximately 250,000 acres in St. Croix County that could be developed. Ironically, that number is very similar to this number of acres in agriculture, 245,000. So some of that agricultural land is that land that doesn't have limitations. Moving on to continue with this discussion, land use conflicts, just wanted to highlight some of those. Protection of water and natural resources from adverse impacts of development and agricultural uses is one of the conflicts. Non-metallic mining operations, impacts of renewable energy systems, anaerobic digesters, solar and wind turbines. We've had plenty of those issues in the county in the last few years. And then we also have conflicts between rural residential and farm operations and CAFOs. So trying to balance all of those uses out across the county is an important part of this project. And please, if there's any items of discussion or questions, let me know. We can discuss those now or keep those to the end. One of the requirements in statutes is to analyze existing land use, and one of the ways that we do that is with the assessment categories, the tax and assessment system. It's the most current and most detailed way that we have to measure land use, and we have records going back many years. So this map is the existing land use using the 2022 assessment categories. The yellow is residential assessment, and obviously you can see the residential impact on the west side of the county, up and down that Somerset, St. Joe, Hudson, Troy area. Town of Hudson is primarily developed. And you can also see the broad swath of agricultural land across the county. We have this really solid area that sweeps up through Aaron Prairie, parts of Hammond and Warren, and down to Troy, where we have some prime agricultural land. As we move over to the east, you can see that we pop up with a little bit more of wooded land and less solid agriculture. Excuse me. So that's available. We did not map the villages and cities because a little bit out of the purview of the comprehensive plan, our rules and regulations don't necessarily apply in the villages and cities. Moving on, we continue to analyze the existing land use from 1987 to 2002. The dark green is agriculture. The lighter green here is forest, and then residential. And one of the caveats of using assessment data is the state changes how land gets assessed, and assessors change how they assess land. So between 97 and 2000, you see a large drop in the agricultural assessment. That was after the full impact of the use value assessment category. So land that was assessed agriculture dropped off and went into undeveloped. So that sort of explains some of that change. Undeveloped can be swamps. It's your road right-of-way on a large agricultural parcel. That 33 feet of right-of-way is also classified as undeveloped. So a good measure actually is going from 2007 to 2022, and you can see that agriculture dropped from 63 to 58%. Residential climbed up a little bit, and we can get into the details and actually look at the numbers of acres that were lost or gained as well. As an example, there were 7,800 acres of agricultural land lost and 6,200 acres of residential increase. Some more discussion of that. And let me say, the discussion of all of this is some of the requirements in state statutes, Chapter 66. So we're not just adding this because it's one of the requirements of the comprehensive planning statutes. So that's why we have this discussion. Another way to look at land is by land cover. This is a data set produced by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources in 2016. The green that in much of the county is cultivated. Lighter green areas are grasslands. Of course, we have our rural residential, which is in the yellow, and you can see that distributed through the various towns. The dark red is urban, darker green is forest. So we do some analysis of that breakdown again, and you can see that, again, agriculture is one of the largest land uses within the county. Again, here's this analysis of housing density. We want to include that because of our use of density in those zoning districts. The density ranges from 0.43 houses per 40 acres in the town of Forest to 7.36 housing units per 40 acres in the town of Hudson. And you can see this group of towns right here are all less than one dwelling unit per 40 acres in their current density. And their zoning is either agriculture or ag 2, or some of those are actually the rural residential, which would allow far more dwelling units than they need and is far above what their existing density is. It would, be many years before they used all that up, and their projected growth is far less than that. We looked at the rural-urban housing split with this graph here from 2010 to 2020, showing that during that time period, the split of rural to urban has gone down a little bit. In 2000, it was 54% rural. Now in 2020, it's 49% rural and 51% in the villages and cities. So you can see that perhaps some more development is occurring in the cities and villages. However, even at this rate, if this split continues and we add the population that we're expecting, we would be developing the rural area and the rural acres and chewing up some of that agricultural land. Analysis of public land. We have a large inventory of Fish and Wildlife Service, DNR, State Park, National Park Service, 17, or I should say in 2022, around 20,000 acres. So we have a good supply of public land for outdoor recreational opportunities and habitat. We have a large section here on the discussion of agricultural land supplies and prices, and we review agricultural land, forest land, and residential land. The one page that I will highlight here is this is ag land acres sold by future use. So the green line is ag land continuing in ag use, and over here is the number of acres that have been sold. Down here is our years. So you can see that there are many more acres sold that are staying in agriculture than are going out of agriculture over the last 10 years. So that's an interesting piece of information. Going back, more land was being converted. Then this graph here is the average price of those. Yes, Scott?
I'm just going to go back a couple of slides, sorry, but I was just curious. In Warren Township, you showed a negative 42 acres. I've very seldom ever heard of property that's public lands going out.
Yeah, I did some review of that, and I'm not sure where that number came from. It was the assessment categories that we were using, and I can't track that down. But it's a good catch, because there were some other ones that I questioned as well and did more research. But I can review that one further as well. Going back to the ag land prices, you can see here that the average price of ag land staying in agriculture is the green line. It's coming up approaching $6,000 and the per acre, and the sort of the gap between ag land converted to other uses and that ag land staying in agriculture is closed a little bit. This is all information that comes from the Department of Revenue and then is collected by the Department of Ag, and they provide this information and statistics. Some of the variability here with those high spikes is due to the limited number of sales. So if you have a couple of sales that are really high, it jumps up and down as far as the average. We reviewed forest sales. Again, forest land is popular. The price is going up. Residential land sales, as we know and recognize, are high. Speaks to the cost of housing in St. Croix County, and it can be a limiting factor. Then moving on to new lots and addresses. So this is an analysis that we've been doing for quite a while. The dark blue at the top is the number of new lots that are created, and the light blue is the number of addresses that get issued. So the difference between all of that ends up building our inventory of vacant lots. So there is quite a bit of inventory of vacant lots in the county, which then speaks to the supply of land for residential development. What the reasons why those lots were developed, weren't developed, I don't know, but maybe somebody bought 2 or 3 of them because they didn't want neighbors or whatever. But there is an inventory out there, which would suggest, new development may or may not be needed at this time. So we have a summary of those land sales, and we talk about natural limitations to development. Those are slopes, shorelines, water bodies, riverway zoning, flood hazard zoning. So these numbers actually will overlap in acres. I don't know if we should have a total there. I would suggest that we review that because these acres do overlap. They're just showing the areas that are under some different regulatory information. Then finally, we move on to the land use projections. So this is an important piece, again, required by statutes, just projecting out the number of acres of land that we're going to need through time. We have it projected out here to 2030. We're showing that between 2020 and 2030, we're going to need approximately 8,500 more acres in residential land use. That could be in the towns, it could be in the villages and cities as well. But the big thing is that county-wide, we have, as we said, we have a surplus of land. All of that agricultural land and other land is available for development. So our supply of land is not an issue. So moving on to this analysis. So given the dynamics of the county and our proximity to the Twin Cities, High 94, river crossing, the small communities and their own comprehensive plans, all of those things can impact growth. So it's difficult to determine these land use projections at a county scale and where growth will occur. So they should be, these projections should be read with the full understanding of the limitations and the parameters used in their development. And then finally, this last sentence right there, there's a sufficient supply of land in St. Croix County to meet the residential, commercial, and industrial growth. One item that I want to draw particular attention to that we thought was important for the plan to recognize is this paragraph right here and then coming down. St. Croix County is challenged by towns that choose to preemptively apply a basic residential zoning district, R2, across their entire town. During the 2017-2019 St. Croix County Comprehensive Zoning Revision process, the county identified scenarios for a number of lots a town could accommodate when they opted for the R2 residential zoning district which allows most agriculture uses and major subdivisions. Of those 5 towns under the current county zoning that went with predominantly R2 residential zoning district, their growth projections from the state of Wisconsin Department of Administration totaled 2,175 new housing units between 2020 and 2040. The 2023 updated projected amount of housing units that could be realized from the blanket R2 residential zoning designation in those 5 towns totals 20 to 25,000 housing units. And the predominant use in those towns is agriculture. So what we're saying is that they are overzoned at this time. So what will that lead to? Perpetuating and promoting disconnected rural residential subdivisions, resulting in increasing costs to maintain new roads and to provide services like school buses, postal package delivery, and garbage service, to name a few. These rural developments are distant from essential services typically found in villages and cities, like the services listed there, sewer and water, healthcare. So it describes some of those impacts to commuting times, energy use, and sustainability, and those type of things. Will continue to fragment the ag land and impacts rural character. Many of the things that we heard in our survey was about rural character and providing different types of subdivisions. And it also creates more opportunities for land use conflicts with new residential dwellings built next to active farming operations. As an alternative that was explored during the comprehensive planning revision process, there was the Ag 2 zoning district, allows 1 dwelling unit per 2 acres of density. This type of density can substantially be accommodated by existing network of roadways. That zoning category could accommodate the 2040 household projections by implementing the Ag 2 zoning district, or the R1 district would be another alternative. So quickly moving on here, the future land use plan map. So in accordance with state planning law, this section summarizes the future land use plan for St. Croix County and contains information required under Chapter 66, required to have a future land use map and the designations that go along with it. The plan identifies areas of similar character, use, and density. The planning areas are not zoning districts. They do not legally set regulatory criteria for land use. These maps were developed with existing land cover and were compared to the town comprehensive plan use maps. So we took the town maps and created a generalized future land use map for the county. As we go through, I'll just quickly go through. Residential is the lighter yellow, noticed here in the town of Hammond. Some here in Hudson, Richmond, some here in Star Prairie. And we have the darker yellow, which is the rural residential, that allows residential and some agriculture. Mixed rural ag through these towns and a couple over here from their land use plans. It's more agricultural based with some residential. And the darker green then is our agriculture. We have commercial districts that were illustrated on many of the town plans. And one of the things that we added was the idea of these commercial nodes. The town of Somerset in their plan used commercial nodes. And we thought that was a good idea to apply those here. They're a more generalized commercial area than having strict boundaries on a parcel. So let me continue on here. I know we've been here a while. The residential is the lighter yellow. I discussed that. Purpose of the residential class is to identify areas suitable for future residential. There may already be residential, and they're delineated as vacant or platted areas, some undeveloped land might be designated for residential. These lands should be zoned R2 or R3 if they meet the requirements for sewer and water. The mixed rural residential, his classification is to identify areas suitable for future residential development. It includes lands that are delineated as existing residential property or vacant platted areas. In addition, undeveloped land has been designated for residential development. So these areas, the county would suggest that they be zoned R1 or R2 under the current county zoning regulations. The mixed rural agriculture, now we're moving into more agriculture and less residential, but it allows some limited residential in this area to protect existing farm and forestry operations. Moving down to the zoning recommendations in the mixed rural ag, the county would recommend R1, Ag 1, or Ag 2. And large, I want to make sure that you're aware of this comment, is large tracts of land under this category are currently zoned R2. So there are quite a bit of amount of land that's zoned R2, again, sort of in that pre-zoning before development would occur. It doesn't mean that the county recommends R1, Ag 1, or Ag 2, that land has to get rezoned. It does not mean that at all, that the zoning designation is the zoning designation. But if there is some rezoning that would occur or some other comprehensive revision in the future, then the county would recommend these zoning districts. The agricultural district was the dark green on the map. The purpose of the ag classification is preserve productive ag lands, protect existing farm and forestry operations from encroachment by incompatible uses. Land within the ag area should be zoned Ag 1 or Ag 2 under the current county zoning. However, there are large tracts of that area that are zoned R1, which is our most agricultural residential district, where it has a 4 per 40 density. Excuse me. Commercial districts recognize the existing commercial from town plans, and we also have our commercial nodes. The purpose of the commercial nodes is to identify the generalized areas near or along major highways and key intersections that have the potential for commercial and light industry. This provides more flexibility to county staff and to landowners when making land use decisions, and rather than having a future land use area that was strictly on a parcel boundary. Next was industrial. There's not a whole lot of industrial in the rural areas, and we will also have larger scale maps, and the future land use map will be online, so we'll be able to see where those areas are. We also have recreation, open space. That's the natural resource areas that were identified on that previous map. DNR, Fish and Wildlife, National Park, county, things like that. So we recommend that those stay are zoned conservation, and it may include riverway, shoreline, or floodplain overlay zones. We also included the primary environmental corridors as an educational overlay that might influence future land use planning decisions. Environmental resources are made up of these factors. It's not necessarily a future land use category. It's an educational overlay. How we will use this going forward is the future land use plan amendments. So as I said in the beginning, we use the future land use map for our zoning staff recommendations to the committee. We've incorporated the future land use policies of the local communities, the towns. So while this plan provides policies applicable for each future land use class, local plans might have slight policy variations that would need to be reviewed at the time of any land use decisions. And the county does not have zoning or subdivision authority within the incorporated jurisdictions. So those areas have not been assigned a future land use classification. Now, we'll go back to the goals and objectives, which you reviewed. Yes, Scott, sorry.
And we're moving through pretty quick on that one, but could you please go back to the zoning map? It's a bunch of pages back.
The future land use map?
Yeah, future land use map.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So as I'm taking a look at that map, I'm noticing that almost all of the quadrants in the northwest and everything west of State Highway 65 seems to be more of the higher density mixed rural. Is that?
That's correct, yep. Mixed rural residential, yeah.
So that's kind of well, there's been changes because in the past, originally, I believe the town of Somerset and town of St. Joe had a much lower density recommendations, and then in the last overhaul of the zoning ordinances, it seems as though they had a change in that to accept a lower or a higher density practice. But then the town of Star Prairie did not do that. They went the exact opposite, and I'm trying to understand how that they made the call that because before the entire township was more of an R2 for higher density, and decided that anything over 15 acres was then redesignated to an R1.
Right, right.
And my question is, how did that come about?
Right. That happened during the comprehensive revision of the zoning ordinance, and we met multiple times with the various towns, either through cluster meetings where we grouped in different quadrants, and we had cluster meetings here, and I also believe we had a specific meeting with the town of Star Prairie and provided different options, and it was through that process that those parcels got zoned or put into R1 for the comprehensive revision.
So my understanding, talking with their town board, that the county staff actually was really pushing for this R1 versus the R2, and I'm trying to understand why you would do that when you're between a major city and two major villages, and then all of a sudden you're going to say, well, this other area, when you have a major corridor coming through Highway 64, it just seems prevalent that that's going to have a lot more development pressure there, and that would be the place to do it versus having it skip over that to another area.
Right. The decisions, I'm not sure how much the county pushed for that or directed that, but I just recall that we had, those meetings with the town and provided different examples of what was possible. From this map, I know, and I believe from the town of Star Prairie itself, it would be possible to go from R1
I think John
back
has
to the
something
R2.
to contribute.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just as a footnote, I was part of those discussions, and staff did not really push or adamantly encourage that. We just brought some thresholds to the town to consider. I think we ended up, anything over 20 acres was R1, anything over 20 acres was R2. It was a suggestion. We weren't necessarily pushing that. We weren't saying you need to do this. It was just more to get the discussion started. So that was my recollection of the process.
Yeah, I'm just in the middle right now at trying to pick up the pieces of that, and
Sure.
we're dealing with
Okay.
all of these owners out there, and we're looking at the cost to these owners is going to be in excess of $1 million to try to convert this back if they do it individually. And so we're looking at options of how to do that change.
Okay. Okay. Going back to the goals and objectives and policies, we have number 1, and you reviewed these previously, so I'm not sure how much you want to go over these at this point. But again, protect the rural character of St. Croix County. So we have many items here regarding green space, conservation design, maintain and promote the viability of agriculture in the county. From our survey that we did in 2022, 71% of residents would prefer that development use less rural land and be more compact around villages and cities. Wanted to protect, excuse me, protect property values by avoiding protect property values by avoiding visual pollution caused by poor design or property maintenance. Goal number 2, balance land use regulation and individual property rights with community interests. Goal number 3, guide and manage development. I'm sorry, I gotta get a drink or something. Here we go, try it again. Guide development to locations and conditions that minimize the adverse impacts. So 83% of residents said too much farmland is be converted to non-farm uses. Another item to identify here, is 3.4, continue to develop planning regulations and ordinances that address the diversity of community needs throughout the county. I think the earlier discussion on ADUs is apropos to that objective there, that we want to update and keep our ordinances current with state law and address the changing needs of the residents. Rural character. It's moving on to the policies. Rural character, the county will encourage conservation site design. We discussed that at length at a couple of our earlier meetings by creating partnerships with developers, surveyors, and outreach to the towns and communities. Thank you. Let's see here. I don't have anything else highlighted on this page. I think we've gone through all of them previously, and I guess my last piece is next steps or questions or further comments, and you can provide those back to John or myself and Nicole or Jason, whoever, all of us, and we can make changes or do inclusions to those things. In October, we anticipate the natural resources chapter and any follow-up to the land use chapter, and then possibly the community utilities and community facilities chapter. And then I guess finally, for staff feedback for us, is this how you want to progress through the rest of it? Now, this was a giant piece that we feel is important. Some of the other chapters may not be as important, at least what staff thinks is important. But do you want to spend time in a regular meeting with these presentations, or is it better to have a separate work session meeting like we had previously?
Committee, what do you think? Work session, or do we want to spend time here? Should we have a work session to hash it out or come back?
I'd vote for a work session.
And then in the work session, Brett, would you suggest we take a couple of the smaller sections at one time, or what do you think?
I think we would take a couple of the smaller sections at one time.
And we would let you guys set it up how you think is best then.
Yeah, we're able to do that. We can focus on a couple chapters at a time, and then we will be on track and that get this adopted probably in the March county board meeting possibly, or at least it'll be before the board in March.
Hope so. Are we looking at calendars then, or are you gonna suggest a date, Survey Monkey kind of thing, or how do you want to do that?
Yeah, I don't have a date right now. We can suggest a Survey Monkey or a poll.
That'll be fine.
Okay,
Good, very good, thank you.
thank you.
Excellent report. I guess we just don't have time for the financials. Oh, I was kidding.
It was a very interesting report by Brett, and the bad news is now we're just going to talk about tiny numbers. So they're not nearly as interesting. On the financial report, just a couple of things that I'm going to point out over the last few months of the year, things that are on my watch list. So under the Register of Deeds, we're looking at the Register of Deeds fees. Last year we were at $754,000. This year we're at $562,000. That's $200,000 off. You can see the economic slowdown in property. That's what that's stemming from. So as different economic indicators flag, you can see them in our financial statement. So that's one. So we are not going to hit the $1 million that we had budgeted for this year. I'll skip through recycling. And again, if you have any particular questions, I'd be happy to answer them. The other one that I'm looking at then is under the Parks Department, and I'm looking at the amount of park fees and rents. So we're at $366,000 this year. Last year at this time we were at $367,000. So we're within $1,000 where we were last year. We finished 2022 at $408,000. So they're budgeted at $381,000. They should easily be able to hit that. Then we'll probably be over that $400,000 mark again. So if you'd look back to 2019, 2020, it was below $300,000. It just spiked up during COVID, and people must have decided they liked the parks because they keep coming back to them then since then. So those are the only two items that I really wanted to point out. Those are the flag items I'm watching right now. But if you do have any other questions on other parts of this budget or financial report, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, we're happy with that. Moving on, Ken, would you like to lead us in consideration of 2024 requested budgets?
Yeah, so we're going to go over the parts of the budget that fall under this committee's jurisdiction. So what happens is the department heads all make their budget request. The finance director and I sit down, we go over all those, so we have a full understanding of what's being asked for. I then add all of that up and compare that to the amount of revenues that I know I'm going to have, net new construction, additional shared revenues from the state, interest earnings increased, and sales tax revenue increases. We sort of know the revenue side, that gets pretty locked in. The more variable side then is all these expenses that have been asked for. So when we look at expenses to revenues, I'm 1.7 million higher on expenses. So that tells me for the budget overall, I have to cut 1.7 million on the expense side. I'm not going to make it up on the revenue side. It's going to be on the expense side. There were nearly 24 new positions requested in the budget. And so I know that not all of those are going to be filled. I'm going to fill probably about 14 of the 24, about 60% of the positions. So that means 10 of the positions being asked for are not going to be filled. I don't think there were any new positions requested in any of these departments. So that's not really pertinent to you. But for the other parts of the budget, that's where a lot of that 1.7 million in savings is going to come from. All right, so looking at your budgets. So first off, we have the Register of Deeds, and I had flagged for you that Register of Deeds fees. You can see the prior 2 years we both finished over $1 million. That's why I had budgeted $1 million for 2023. For 2024, Beth has reduced her ask down to $828,000. I forgot to kind of highlight too my opening line on these budgets. When you look at the budget, the way to look at them is first slide all the way over to that far right column. So this column right here, this fiscal year 24, that's what's being asked for by the department heads. So this is the requested column that we're really talking about. Everything else is for comparison. Then when I'm looking at the budget, what I want to look at is I want to look at the very first line. And the Register of Deeds is a bad example of this, but it's the general property taxes. So I want to see what the difference is between last year's general property taxes, which is 2 columns back, which is the adopted budget, and the requested budget. So there's a $200,000 difference there And it's going, hers is negative because she has more revenue than expenses. Hers is negative by $200,000 because she has $200,000 less of fees that she's going to be collecting under her projections. So we know that, her revenues are affecting the budget, but that impacts the rest of the budget. And there's $200,000 less that I have to make up somewhere else in the budget. And that's all built into this 1.7 million deficit that I have to solve. So when I'm looking at the budget though, then, so I look at that revenue, I look at the impact on the general property taxes. Then there's two other expense items that I want to look at. I want to look at the net wages and fringes to see where the change is there. So it's $446,000 this year compared to $406,000 last year. If there's any new positions, you'd see that in there. Really, this difference, about $40,000, is just the typical wage and benefit changes that you might see. So we have a 1% COLA built into the budget. We have a step increase, 1% increase in health insurance. WRS was up just a little bit. So that's what's working in here. You do see under her line items, health insurance, that $40,000, a large part of that is health insurance, where it's going from $85,000 to $112,000. That's just the mix of her staff. So we budget staff at their actual health insurance plans, whether they're picking a single plan or picking a family plan. And so sometimes those change from one year to the next, and the family plans cost more. So you can see that change happening. That's what's occurring here. It isn't because the insurance rates went up by that much. It's just what that employee group is selecting. In the end, it all seems to sort of work itself out across the organization. The next item, though, on expenses that I want to look at is almost to the bottom. I want to look at the operating expenses. So the wages and fringes, they have really little control over. The department heads don't get to say, well, I want to change everyone's salary, or I want everyone to take single health insurance plans. That's out of their control. Those are going to be guided by our county policies. But they do have control over those, the operating expenses. So that's the next item that I want to look at to see how that has changed. And so right now, Beth has asked for $79,000 compared to $83,000 last year. Small decrease there. As long as it's going down, I probably don't bother looking any further at what's going on. So everything's good there. So that's how I look at the budgets. So I'll go through each of these. I'm going to highlight sort of those highlight numbers that I talked about. And if there's any variances, we'll then dig a little deeper to see where those variances are. All right, under the parks budget. So parks, we'll start at that first line. We'll look at the general property taxes. So general property taxes for 24 are $419,000 compared to $395,000 in 2023. So it's up by about $25,000. That's fairly small, as you see, as we talk about most of these. We'll look at the net wages and fringes, $568,000 compared to $561,000. So very minimal change there at all. So not much is happening there to impact that $25,000. So when we look at the operating expenses, $354,000 compared to $335,000. There's where that difference is coming in. If we go back and we try to find where some of these changes are, you can see a $6,000 increase in the first line, other professional services, an extra $1,500 for electricity, an extra $3,000 in other contractual services. Those are things like garbage collection and things that they do in the parks. So it's just little things. These are inflationary pressures that you're seeing, and we'll see these throughout the budget. But you can see where inflation is starting to tick us up, particularly in utilities and contract services. All right, moving on to resource, land, and water conservation. So the first thing we look at is we look at that general property tax line. So it's at $310,000 compared to $255,000 last year. So there's a good $60,000 increase. Typically, I would jump down and start looking at the net wages and fringes, although I'm going to tell you that those are about the same as they were last year. They're only up $9,000. I'm going to stop here, though, and really look at some of these other revenue items that we have. Because what we see is the state culture, recreation, and educational grants decrease from $367,000 to $158,000. So that's a big decrease. And that is decreasing our total revenues, and our total expenses will be down. But that's part of the reason why you're seeing that $50,000 increase in the general property taxes. Is there's a grant that we're not getting, and we are reducing the amount of cost sharing that we're doing. So if you look on the expenses, where we did $390,000, now we're doing $213,000 of land conservation cost sharing. Less grants come in, less grants are going out, less projects are going to be done in the county. So that's what you're seeing affected there. And then we also did reduce our other professional services. All those supplies and expenses are up a little bit. So overall, that budget is down, but the impact of the property tax is about $60,000 higher. All right, moving on to the planning department. General property taxes, there's a negative $1. That's a rounding error. That'll be fixed before we finalize the budget. So there's no general property taxes that are supporting this. This is all fees driven. If we look at the amount of land records retained fees, it went from 180,000 last year to 100,000. So we saw the decrease in register of deeds. Well, the land record fees are tied directly to that. So when you see their revenue drop, you're going to see our revenue drop. So we did decrease that. One of the ways that we offset, though, that decrease without having to dramatically decrease their budget is they're a separate fund. So we were able to use fund balance applied. We typically haven't over the past few years, but hopefully this is just a down cycle and it's going to come back up. So we're going to use some of that fund balance to get us through this year without having to dramatically reduce the program of service that we're offering. Net wages and fringes are almost identical to the prior year. It's like $200 difference. And if you look at their operating expenses at the bottom of this page, they went from 167,000 to 114,000. So there was some decrease, particularly in the mapping. Mapping's done every other year. Yeah. Either I guessed right or it's close enough. Yeah, the aerial photography is done every other year. So you see that drop. That's where that cost difference primarily is from there. We also had some other professional services decrease. Other than that, most of their expenses are similar to the prior year. All right, on to the zoning department. So we look at that first line, that general property taxes. So that's up $100,000 from $1.6 million to $1.7 million. So we want to sort of take a look at what's going on there. I am seeing a $60,000 decrease in other regulatory permits and fees. So again, when we have economic slowdown, less land development being done, we are going to see reduced fees. So part of that reduction in fees that are coming in are going to have to be made up by property taxes if we maintain the same level of service that we have. If we look at the net wages and fringes, we go from 1.6 million to 1.68 million. So there's about a $40,000 increase. That's really just the same wage and benefit increases that we're seeing across the board. There's nothing different going on there. And when we look down at the total operating expenses, they go from 380,000 to 382,000. So there's nothing that's changed within the operating expenses. What we're trying to do is maintain the same level of service, even though we anticipate a decrease in the amount of fees. And so it's being made up for in that general property tax line. Recycling. Recycling, it's got that negative $2 on general property tax. That's a rounding issue, we'll correct. Basically, how the recycling works is we get a state sanitation grant. That money comes in. We cover one staff position with that, and then we contribute that money back out. So this bottom expense line right there is other grants and contributions. So those are grants that we give back out to the local units of government, basically to get us to a balanced budget. So state grant comes in, we pay for our staff, we give the rest of the money away as grants to the local units of government. Hazardous waste. This is our collection program. So the general property taxes on that, last year were 60,000. They're asking for 55,000 next year. Basically what they did was they decreased the amount of other professional services. That decrease in their expense expectation allowed us to decrease the amount of property tax necessary to cover this program. And we had switched vendors last year, and I think we've switched vendors again this year, but we're realizing some cost savings in that program compared to the estimate that we had last year when we had switched vendors and kind of thought it would be a lot higher. If you look at our last two experiences, under other professional services, it was 66,000 and 52,000. So the $68,000 estimate we have, we think is good. The event is going on right now, so if you have any hazardous waste, make sure you get it tomorrow over to the Hudson Highway shop. The library. So the county board has already seen the resolution on the library. So it's not a $650,000 increase in the library, even though it looks that way. What's going on is who's paying it has changed. So the Hudson Joint Library went back to a Hudson standalone library. So the three exiting partners, the town of St. Joseph's, the town of Hudson, and the village of North Hudson, who were previously members, were paying to the library directly. And so they said, well, we're not going to pay directly to the library. We're going to let the county levy the rural library tax against our municipalities, and then the county will pay the Hudson Library that circulation. So who pays changes. So it looks like a big tax increase on the county side, and those three municipalities are going to think that the county had a big tax increase because they're going to have a 20.0002 tax for the library that they've never had before. It's going to show up on the county line, so they're going to think the county raised taxes. That's really not the case. That's not what's happening. It's just who's taxing them. I don't know if those three municipalities are going to decrease the tax on their side. That's not a requirement that they have to. You know, that'd be swell if they did. Don't you think, Bill? Yep. But I don't know if they're going to reduce their municipal levy by what they're not levying anymore for the library. Otherwise, they're just going to see our increase for the library. But again, it's just a redistribution of who's paying that tax. It's not really a tax increase. Actually, the rate is down from what the rate was last year. UW Extension, last year we levied $254,463. This year, $254,703. So about a $250 increase. The main line for them really is their other professional services. This is the contract service we have for their educators. That was up by a few $1,000s, and they reduced some of their other expenses to keep the levy amount equivalent to what it was the prior year. The fairgrounds had no change to the amount that they requested. They requested $80,000 last year, requested $80,000 again next year, so the levy amount is exactly the same. Economic development, $117,000 last year, $119,000 this year. The $2,000 increase as a request for the St. Croix County Economic Development Corporation for a couple $1,000s extra. And that is the end of the budget presentation. So what input I'm looking for from you is that if there's anything that you strongly support or strongly don't support, now would be a great time to tell me. As I'm finalizing the budget, I can get those changes in before it gets to the Committee of the Whole presentation. Really between the Committee of the Whole and the County Board public hearing in November, there's a lot less chance to change the budget. We actually have more chance right now, while I still have some flexibility to shift things around. So if there's anything you really like or really don't like, you can say it now. All right, great.
it'd be better to rip it apart now if you're gonna, instead of doing it at the committee of the whole or waiting until later, because it's, this is the time. I'm gonna live with economic development. I'm not gonna make a scene later on. And if you wanna rip apart parks, let's do it now. Or if you're gonna be unhappy with library or economic, or extension or whatever, let's do it now. Otherwise, let's live with it. We're good?
I'm good.
All right. I appreciate that.
Ken, and the staff and everybody that's been involved with doing this, as always, thank you for your job that you did to put this together. I know there's a lot of facets to try to piece all this and make it all come together and keep numbers that are going to work for the county. And I very much appreciate your diligence in getting it done. Thank you.
Yeah, if you think of the thousands of staff hours that probably go into assembling all this over several months period of time to get it to a final product. Yep, it is a big undertaking.
And it's fun to make fun of you too.
Yeah.
But it really is, it's an amazing, I want to say, my wife does this for a living, and I watch her agonize over this stuff, and it really, there is nothing easy about this. So I've got nothing but admiration for you guys. I don't know why you do it for the money.
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to move on. I guess we're pretty close to done. We're going to ask Jason for his update.
All right, well, I had a lot, but since we're so close to being done, like Ken mentioned, and that the clean sweep is going on today and tomorrow with electronics and tires and appliances on Saturday. Was out there this afternoon, hour and 45 minutes, and that after it opened, we had over 200 vehicles come through in that time. The nitrate clinics that have been held by our staff, they had 362 samples total, which is down slightly from 400 from last year, but still a really good turnout. Bass Lake, they completed a shoreline inventory. The Brad Dorwin manure pit was closed that we cost shared. They're putting up some wader boot stations for aquatic invasive species at hunting grounds throughout the county. Yeah, they're putting in wader boot stations for like cleaning off waders near hunting grounds for aquatic invasive species. There was some grant money for that. And they're establishing an online landowner database so that if staff, and I hope we don't have any turnover, but if staff turn over, that these outreach events that we're doing, they'll have contacts in there for cover crops or contacts in there and that for waterway, you know, so that they know when they get grant funding who to go and contact right away. There's a lot of grants that Tim and his team have been doing over the last couple of weeks, so that should make our budget look better. Parks, I don't have a lot. Halloween at Homestead is scheduled for October 28th. So JR and his team we're working to get that all set up and have staff for it. Glen Hills with our weather and that still is busy and that for the camping. Corey, our surveyor, is going to be starting the Wildwood Trail survey as soon as the leaf come off. And that he's tried doing some survey work lately, and even with our new GPS, it's just not accurate and time efficient, I will say, in that to be able to get the GPS to work. We got Board of Adjustment next week for land use. Our staff took floodplain training. Land use permits we're kind of slower there for a little bit. Now everything's kind of ramping up for fall. Same thing as the sanitary permits. Overall, sanitary is down year to year compared to last year. Brett and his team, as you can see, they've worked a lot on the comprehensive plan amendment. And another big thing that has been in the works is the new beacon platform. So the county, of course, had WebGuide Extreme for many years, and that was through ADC. ADC sold out of that, so now it's Snyder Geospatial that owns that company. They've created this new beacon, and that is on the county's website now. We're gonna give it a test for a couple weeks, and that to see, you know, if everybody's moving over to the new platform, and then as soon as that happens, then we'll convert over to that. So, that conversion is hopefully gonna be around October 2nd. And eventually, then the county compass software would go away, so eventually. Our GIS staff has been working a lot. Of course, we did have NG 911 completed, but there's just a never-ending process to keep on improving that data. So we met the minimum standards, but now they're working through and just cleaning up. Right now with Doug, I talked to him, he's managing like 3 different databases, and the goal is in that to eventually get that combined into one. So just short and sweet, that's what I've got right now.
Doug's GIS guy.
Doug, yep, A Vols, yep. Yep.
Okay. Thank you. That's a lot. Announcements and correspondence.
Okay, Mr. Chair, we had a plaque presented to us. This is from the State of Wisconsin Natural Resources Board. It's an acknowledgement of the gift of land that St. Croix County did back in 2019. St. Croix County was gifted some money from the DNR to take and, you know, use it for conservation efforts. Part of that money was used to purchase some property. It was 2.55 acres from Christine Bishop. And that property was surrounded by the Will River Park. And then the county, once they purchased that, turned around and gifted that to the DNR. So anyway, so here's the plaque that we received.
usable?
Yep. So if you want to see, I did make a couple maps. It's where the parcel is in white there that says the town of Hudson. That is the parcel. It's right off of Trout Brook Road.
Yeah.
So if you want to look at the plaque.
Where are you gonna hang the plaque?
Yeah, so that was resolution number 15. I don't know if you want to see it back in 2019.
No, anybody wanna see the resolution? No, we're good.
Okay.
All right. Any other announcements and correspondence?
That's all I've got.
That's pretty cool, plaque. Requests for future agenda items. Scott?
Like the thought of consideration for a notice to people who have change of zoning hearings by mail, like a postcard or something, so that people can become aware. So we have more transparency when this happens. So otherwise, basically, the policy right now is that it's posted in 3 places in the towns. And so generally a couple of bulletin boards and on the town's website. The majority of the people in that last one were not aware of it, so.
Discuss it as an agenda item.
Yeah, I'm just trying to give you the background why to do it, but that's,
Yep.
I'd like to see that as a consideration.
Yep, we can put that on an agenda, and then we can have a good conversation about it. That's a nice idea. Okay, any other agenda items right now? Sean?
I think we already stated it, but just to restate the follow-up on the accessory dwelling units.
My hearing's going.
The follow-up on the accessory dwelling units, we already discussed putting it in the agenda.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Just
we're
restating it.
gonna talk about it on October 19th, and then we're gonna go to the October 26th. Yep, that's absolutely happening. Any other agenda items?
I've got a couple, Mr. Chair. I'd like to have the fee schedule on that meeting.
Well, yep,
And then also, and that we'd have another, well, we have some other operational stuff, some rezones and a public hearing on the text for the waiver reduction. And that to allow that to be just an administrative permit. So that was at your guys' last meeting, so.
right.
And then there'll be a DNR grant resolution just to allow Tim and me to sign off on this one particular grant that we can't get around having a resolution on.
That I remember talking about that. And part of the fee structure is Chair Long wants us to talk about the fees at the loop trail. So
Correct. Yep.
We'll frame that in that way.
And then, and that depending on you, Mr. Chair, and that we also have the documents that Supervisor Shirley requested from the St. Croix County Economic Development Corporation, also, so.
Well, I'm gonna talk to the administrator, we're gonna, talk about that again. I'll let you know.
Okay.
All right. Anybody else? Anything? Nope, we'd established that. Date of the next meeting, Thursday, October 19. And then, following that, we'll have October 26. And having said that, we will adjourn. Thank you.